If you've been following this channel for a while, you've probably noticed that there has not been an S10 video since late 2020. And that's because just a week after posting the last S10 episode, I bought and moved into my very first house. So my focus has shifted to the excitements and horrors of first-time homeownership, which up until recently has left little time to work on the S10, as most of the time in the past year or so, I've been fixing the mistakes of the previous homeowners and making sure I have something reliable to drive to work every morning. But free time did eventually come around, and I finally got the S10 registered and put together enough to get it on the road. And if you recall from the previous episode, I went with the FiTech system, and this is where I found out how horrible this system actually is. And I know that's a very blunt and rather harsh statement to make, but I do have evidence to back up my claim in this video. So let's dive right into why you should not buy a product from FiTech. This is only part of the story of my FiTech troubles. We made another video over on Fuzzy Dice Projects outlining my horrible customer service experience with FiTech, which you can find via the link in the description. This video will primarily cover events following that experience, including my findings that FiTech themselves failed to find, which point to why the unit likely failed, as well as to why many people seem to have problems they can't chase down on their units. So I sent my unit out in the beginning of November 2021, and FiTech actually had the unit in their possession for nearly 5 weeks. I received the unit back in mid-December, just a few days before Christmas. In their defense, they actually did a great job repackaging the unit and added more styrofoam to the box than when I shipped it to them. However, it immediately became clear that they damaged the ECU cover while it was in their possession and actually lost one of the screws on this cover. Despite the fact that this ECU probably is unsalvageable, the fact that they left this screw out is pretty unprofessional. Now, before we dive into my findings with the FiTech board itself, I just want to share a few statistics that I came up with based on some polls I conducted in both the Holley and FiTech groups. And just a quick disclaimer, while we try to make this poll as scientific and unbiased as possible, I would still consider the results inconclusive. The questions don't dive into any specific product or model number, but do still give you a rough idea on where people stand with both product lines. So the first question I asked was a little bit more broad, and it basically asked if FiTech and Sniper owners had no problems, minor problems corrected with changes to the install, or more serious problems requiring manufacturer involvement. Counting the more serious problems as a product failure, the product failure rate for both the FiTech and the Holley were both surprisingly right around 24.7%. And surprisingly again, roughly 46% of both FiTech and Holley users had a minor issue that was resolved with a change to the install. Alright, so both products have statistically similar failure rates, at least according to this poll. So how does their customer service pan out? To figure that out, I asked a very similar question that was a little bit more specific. I asked those who had a serious issue whether or not it was resolved at the owner's expense, whether it was resolved in warranty, or whether it was resolved out of warranty. To serve as a checksum to the first question, I also added a no issues option to the second poll. The results of this poll were far more telling than the first. And I think this is where Holley goes above and beyond to make things right, where FiTech falls short. Holley was willing to cover 88% of repairs regardless of warranty, while FiTech would only cover 45%. That means more than half of FiTech owners had to fix their units at their own expense, even if there was a defect in the product that was not immediately clear. And to conclude these stats, here's one that illustrates how many people responded to the polls. In the FiTech group with 15,539 members, 444 people responded to the first poll question, or about 2.85% of the total group population. In the Holley group with 21,012 members, 230 people responded to the first poll question, or about 1.1% of the total group population. And this is why I argue that the results are inconclusive. While responses for both groups were in the hundreds, it is still representative of only a small percentage of people who own these products. One thing that I was determined to do, and that I promised the FiTech online community that I would do, was to remove the resin from the ECU board and figure out why it failed in the first place. While I was waiting for the FiTech to ship back from California, I actually did a little bit of research online and found several ways to remove resin from circuit boards, and determined that boiling it in hot water was probably the most effective way to remove it while also preserving the board and preventing heat or chemical damage. The most obvious drawback to this method is that water and circuitry generally don't mix. However, in this case, the circuit board wasn't working and I couldn't really get the unit to power on, so I didn't have much to lose in that sense. I could at least see the board physically and determine if anything burnt up or if there was some kind of short circuit that I could not see. The science here is that water in liquid form is incapable of exceeding 212 degrees Fahrenheit in most cases, which means that the board being suspended in the water can really only reach that temperature, as any water higher than 212 degrees Fahrenheit will boil off before it has the chance to further heat the board. So the risk of burning or damaging my girlfriend's beautiful cookware is also unlikely. She wasn't home when I filmed this. One thing I was actually really surprised to learn with this method is how soft the resin actually gets at this temperature. Before boiling, it essentially had the consistency of ABS plastic, and after boiling, it was surprisingly close to the consistency of Jell-O, and would flake off in small chunks. It would also cool relatively quickly, so I had to work fast and boil the board multiple times. After a considerable amount of resin was removed, I was able to find the 4 screws that held the board onto the cover and was able to remove them relatively easily with a standard Phillips screwdriver. Once the board was removed from the cover, it was even easier to completely remove all of the resin, and at one point I didn't even have to boil it anymore. It kind of just peeled off in one sheet. Once the resin was off, it was immediately clear the level of craftsmanship, or lack thereof, that was used to manufacture these boards. While many of the board components and solder work are actually acceptable, the biggest thing that stands out here are the solder joints connecting the wiring harness to the circuit board. Many of these connections were made with so-called cold joints, where the solder doesn't have enough time to bond the metals together, and a crack or break in the solder can occur, which could potentially break the electrical connection. Since my unit started to work intermittently before completely failing, my theory after seeing the board was that these solder joints could be expanding and contracting during heat soak and causing inconsistent voltages across one or more connections to the board. And most of the wires had an excessive amount of conductor exposed that could come in contact with other wires or other components on the board. Since the board essentially reached engine temperatures during the boiling process, I figured it was worth trying to hook it up to power to see if any kind of heat cycling may have occurred. And sure enough, when it is connected to power, the tuning screen is able to talk to the ECU with the ignition wire connected to 12 volts. Whereas previously the entire unit would boot loop with the key on, regardless of whether the fuel pump is connected or not, which made it impossible to get trouble codes. But as you can see here, I'm able to connect to the ECU and see all the trouble codes I had before the unit went completely haywire. To further verify that the system was working, I looked at a couple variables including battery voltage and the ambient air temperature, which you can see here is colder than Mark Zuckerberg. This power supply is also very good at putting out exactly 14 volts, as these type of power supplies are usually used to power sensitive equipment for charging lithium polymer batteries. I'm also pretty sure this is how they charge Zuck. Now with the board showing signs of life, I really do want to try and rehabilitate it by reworking all of those solder joints so the conductors are the correct length, and give the solder ample time to heat properly so that the connections actually bond together as they should. But before I do that, let's go get the opinion of an actual electrical engineer. So let's take the board over to my buddy's house and get it under his video microscope and get some input from him. So this is my longtime friend from high school. He holds a degree in electrical engineering, and he has about 10 years of professional experience in the aerospace industry, plus about 20 years overall experience as an electronics hobbyist. So it's safe to say he's pretty proficient in circuit board manufacturing and has a pretty good idea of what to be looking for here when I show him the board.
So you'd say these surface mount joints are sufficient.
It's typical. I don't see any weird. It feels fine.
But you would definitely agree with me that these joints are
that's terrible.
insufficient.
It doesn't. I don't know why the insulation is so far back from the solder joint.
Yeah. Now, would you? Yeah, because
So
that insulation should be right up against the board, pretty much, right?
Well, not necessarily, but it should
very
be close
close.
enough. Because the thing is, unless they have a jig to hold these
Like
things,
it should be like this one right here, right?
yeah,
That would be acceptable.
That's pretty normal measure. But they're trying to save costs. I mean, you did say this is a cheaper product, right?
It's close to the Holley in price, but I'm sure the Holley has a similar where they pot the wires directly to the board.
Was it like that when you could you see that through the potting when you first?
No, that's what surprised me is this was all covered by the potting.
Because what will happen a lot of times too.
And the reason I wanted to pull the potting up is because it was kind of boot looping, so I figured there was a power delivery issue.
Possible. So the thing you can notice too, depending on how when they manufacture the cabling, if you don't do the wire stripping correctly, you can end up where you start getting those stray strands off of there. So if they were just using like manual tools to do the stripping, you could end up like that.
Yeah, and I'm sure
I
they
know
were.
for like all the stuff when we do aerospace components, the stripping tools we all have are very specifically set to a certain gauge of wire, so it doesn't cut the actual strands when it strips. Like it's designed to stop before it hits. Like that.
Oh yeah, like look at these signal
That's
wires.
pretty terrible, honestly.
This one too. This is I did not tamper with these. I mean,
it really was like that on Toyota. So here's my question.
look at this one.
What's the back of the board look like? The actual solder joints.
This one.
I want to take a brief second to point out the design and hidden nature of this logo. We'll talk about it in a few minutes in the next section of the video.
No, I want to see what the through hole. It was all the surface mount stuff there was pretty good.
Yeah, this looks a little rough here. Let's put this right here. Like, these look a little rough, but they're consistent and they're not in danger of crossing
it
over.
looks like it wasn't touched up at all.
Now I think this is a heat sink because this was in contact or close to
a
the
heat spreader.
which that seems diesel. Now they trim this, which I guess that's also
that's typical. And it looks like the through holes themselves are actually in good shape on this side. Because basically what I was looking for is when they did the through hole soldering, how much coverage do they have of the solder joint on the pad in the back? So it looks like the solder itself, they used enough of it and they got it hot enough where it does fill the hole.
right.
So what you're looking for, like a Costco spec or something like that, is that it actually it fully covers the land and that it covers in the hole enough. They don't look like it's cold. It's tough to say. I mean,
There's a couple. Let me see if I can find. There was a couple that I was like, these look a little
possible. Oh, hold on. I don't know. I'm not feeling that a little bit.
as in.
It doesn't look like it whipped the wire. Like the wire itself didn't get hot, and it just kind of shoved the wire into a hot solder joint.
Which would be
I mean, on the
which
back.
would technically still be a cold joint, right?
On the back, it looks like it got hot enough, so it's probably okay. And you can see it's
The wire didn't get hot though.
Yeah, and it's copper wire with coating on it, so that's fine. But it looks like the back of it looks fine. I mean, this. So this part of the solder joint isn't going to be the critical side.
And this shouldn't come loose that easily, right? Oh, like look at that.
Well, there you go. But no, I mean, like I said, if you swear on it that you haven't been like beating the hell out of this thing, it's unpotted, then that's not normal.
Yeah. No, when I unpotted it, I did use a metal tip screwdriver, but I was very gentle, and the potting came right off.
But I don't know why, if this is okay for them, or I know that all the boys we manufacture when we do aerospace stuff, but the strands are not supposed to be this far back.
So let's briefly talk about that logo that is on the back side of the board and inaccessible to the consumer without essentially doing what I did and removing all the resin. So when I shared some clips from the video microscope to the FiTech Facebook group, someone anonymously sent me a website from China that has this logo on their homepage, but it's not anywhere on FiTech's American, California-based website. And while it is not at all unusual for American companies to do trade with China, I thought it was a little odd that the company they are trading with has a similar name and somewhat similar logo, and that the Chinese website has a very, very generic product listing page, whereas the American site sells very specific products with very specific product numbers and prices. I think it's also worth pointing out that this hidden board logo really drives home the point that this entire board was completely outsourced, which likely means that there was little to no quality control oversight through the entire manufacturing process. And if the same people that made this website are working on the boards, that really explains a lot, because this website just looks like it was designed 10 or 15 years ago with all this stock photo nonsense that really fails to establish a brand, or really what the hell they're trying to sell. I mean, obviously they're trying to sell car parts, but there's really no information to their specific application other than a vague description of what they do. Now, after a little bit of stumbling through the website's unintuitive navigation links, I did eventually land on a timeline graphic which very briefly mentions the founding of 3 US-based companies, including the California-based FiTech company. This small finding drove me to do a much more extensive online search, which led me to the LinkedIn profiles of 2 company founders, both of who are based in the US. Now let me just state right now that I'm not here to criticize any one individual. Both of these guys actually have an extensive and impressive list of engineering and business accomplishments. I don't doubt for a second that they put a lot of time and effort into their product design and software, but their profile summary did also confirm my suspicions that they partnered with this so-called high-tech enterprise based out of China. This is the same high-tech enterprise that can't strip or solder wires using basic hand tools, and somehow can't find anyone to spell check their own website or find decent looking stock photos that look like they're from this decade. It's blank. There's no pages here. What news? Where's the news? Alright, I don't want to go too far off topic here, but I do have a few quick examples of enterprise websites that actually make sense. Even with a bunch of stock photos and technical jargon, it's pretty easy to quickly figure out what companies like Bosch do. And Bosch is a big company, like their logo's on a lot of things, including this FiTech product. And yeah, they have some cheesy stock photos of futuristic looking cars like this one here, but they do have their website split out and organized in a very understandable manner. And it's easy to understand what their goals and their missions and their existing accomplishments are. And it's hands down also my favorite combination wiper blade, toothbrush, and emissions defeat device manufacturing company. Same thing with Siemens' website. They're also a huge enterprise, and what do you know, their news section actually has news. Let's try a random one that probably no one here has ever heard of. So I work in construction, and I was charged with getting some quotes for a multi-zone audio system, and the subcontractors said, oh yeah, this system's Dante capable, and I was like, what the f is Dante? So I looked it up, and here's the website. And as you can see, it very easily and quickly explains what they do, what they sell, how it works, and oh wow, they also have a news site. Anyways, I think I've criticized them enough. Let's jump into part 6, which is the installation of the Holley Sniper on the S10. Now we really only have to summarize the installation, because if you've watched the episode where we install the FiTech, it's actually fairly similar. And since that system was already installed, systems like the fuel pump and fuel line do not need to be reinstalled, so it's really just a matter of swapping over all of the wires. So if you're curious on how to install one of these fuel injection systems, be sure to check out that video linked in the description and in the card above. To humor the Facebook lube techs out there, we actually did read the installation instructions for the Holley, as we did for the FiTech back in 2020. and made sure to use best practices when making electrical connections. It was to be expected, but the actual installation was a breeze and probably took only about an hour to complete since most of the supporting equipment was already installed. The biggest difference for the Holley was that we needed a computer to set up the SD card on the Holley tuner in order to set the bass tune for it to start learning. And this part actually took us longer than the installation of the physical unit on the truck. And for a short while there, I feared that maybe purchasing a Holley product automatically enrolled us in Club Boomer, where we become completely computer illiterate and need to call Holley's tech support to help us out. But then I remembered I'm actually just a millennial and can use a computer better than I can use a screwdriver. Father, I cannot click the carburetor.
Use SD. Reboot device.
Once we updated the firmware, we were quickly able to set the tune for a 350 V8. Setting the parameters was very similar to setting them on the FiTech, with really the only difference being that this is more of a wizard style setup with a step-by-step screen interface, while the FiTech had more of a table where you would go to each tuning item and change the value from a drop-down. Once the wizard has been completed, it finds the closest base file to use to start the engine, and from there it will self-learn and tune itself further.
Oh, look, it found a tune.
A thing.
The Za.
Aha! Fuel pump.
Nice.
Good noises. I heard
Boost cycle ignition.
the idle air control or something up here ticking too. Hey, numbers.
It's doing a thing.
Hey, there's numbers.
I guess let's get the harnesses off of the...
Yeah, let's tidy that up a little bit.
Let's see what we get.
Okay, okay. Well, I'll keep an eye on them. They should actually be okay, the wires. I mean.
No data, that's...
Initially, we were unable to get any kind of data to the screen, and it didn't start right away, but after a couple key cycles, it did eventually fire up, and we haven't had an issue with it since. So I'm not sure what that was about, if it just needed to reboot, or if it was trying to find a base fuel air mix to get the engine going and then go from there.
Got the gauges.
Mm-hmm.
Ready?
Yep. I was like, oh, it's sparking, and then my eardrums blew out.
Let's try again.
Yeah, do it again. Well, I don't know. It shouldn't. It should know. There's no sensor.
See, what does it say? Open loop? It should stay in open loop, I think, because there's no O2 sensor.
You'd think it would know too.
After the holidays, Mike and I met up again to try and fix my alternator alignment, as well as get the S10 out to do a Holley Sniper road test. At some point I will be making an episode just on the alternator bracket, because there was no off-the-shelf solution to mount an alternator in an S10 with a short water pump V-belt configuration, at least that I could find for under $50 or so. So make sure you are subscribed to get updates on that when it comes out. Once the belt and charging system were checked and concluded to be working, we felt pretty confident that it was time to take the truck out on the road. I was understandably a bit nervous since the last time the truck saw the road, the FiTech system died and left me stranded away from the house multiple times in a row. So in this episode, we're not going to be driving it very far from the house, but in future episodes we are going to try and get more than 20 miles on it just to prove a point to FiTech. This is also Mike's first ride in the S10, and while he has a V8 Blazer, I think most, if not all, of his projects have an automatic transmission which behave a lot differently under load. So it'll be interesting to see how he compares this drivetrain to his after the drive. Despite the AFR being all over the place, it almost immediately finds 14 to 1 when RPMs and load remain steady, whereas the FiTech system would either drift lean or drift rich, and it seemed to be happening entirely randomly. The most important factor that will differentiate this from the FiTech, though, is if it'll fall on its face when returning to idle. But as you can see here, we pulled into a parking lot and it idled absolutely perfectly. And we were able to take it back up to speed, pull through the gears again, and then return it right back down to idle.
Keeping it really rich and idle. Yeah, well, let's see her really on it. I was watching it get down to like 11. It went really rich, but it was doing fine. That's fine.
And now it's back around 13.
Yeah, but it's
After the drive, Mike and I sat down to have some dinner inside the house while we waited for the engine to cool, and he did mention that the truck does seem to pull harder than his Blazer, probably due to the manual transmission and Vortec heads. So if we ever do get around to racing, I know that's been in the talks for about 3 years now, it will be very interesting to see which truck is faster and by how much. And even Mike agreed with me he might have to up the horsepower on his truck before we race. After a very productive conversion from FiTech to Holley, I think we've reached a good stopping point for this video, and now that I'm settled in and more comfortable with homeownership, I think I can spend more of my time and budget on getting this truck running, and hopefully make more videos about it very soon. So what's next? Well, there's a lot of different ways we can go from here. We actually wrote a completely different script for this FiTech rant, and it was actually originally going to be one video where we talked about the bad customer service experience while also filming funny gags involving the FiTech unit, gradually destroying it in the process. But since discovering what the actual problem might be, we figured it might be worth trying to get it running again, even with hours of my own labor poured back into it. So be sure to tune in soon, as we will be reflowing the solder on the board and fixing all of those bad connections. And in the future, we will install it on a spare engine and do some benchmark testing. And if that doesn't work out, we have our trusty Nintendo Zapper handy to take care of the problem. So be sure to subscribe to my channel and Mike's channel, Fuzzy Dice Projects, and we'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.